The wind had a mind of its own. At first, I thought it was merely restless, tossing pine needles and dry leaves across the narrow trail that wound through the ridge. But the moment I inhaled deeply, I knew it carried something else. A scent that should not have been here. A coppery, bitter tang that curled through the air like smoke, though no fire flickered anywhere. The forest ahead was quiet, almost too quiet, save for the sighing of the wind and the occasional rattle of loose stones tumbling down the slope. I paused, adjusting the straps of my pack, and tried to tell myself it was a campfire from deeper in the mountains, perhaps a group of hunters or campers. Yet when I squinted through the dense trees, I saw nothing, no glimmer of flame, no thin line of smoke rising above the ridge. Just the wind, purposeful and erratic, weaving around the trunks and underbrush as if it had been choreographed. Pressed against me in pulses, brushing my hair, tugging at my jacket, tugging at something deeper, something buried beneath reason. The scent grew stronger as I moved forward, subtle at first, like the faint smolder of wet leaves after a summer lightning strike. I could feel it now in my sinuses, metallic and sweet, and my chest tightened in response. My boots crunched on the littered ground. Pine cones split open, bark flakes curling at the edges. Every step I took seemed to disturb the wind's pattern. Whirls of air wrapped around my calves and waist, brushing against my neck as if it were trying to guide me, or chase me. Then I noticed the ash. It drifted down lazily from above, not in the form of smoke or cinder, but thin, gray flakes that disintegrated on my tongue when I opened my mouth. I looked up, expecting the canopy of firs and spruce to hide a fire somewhere beyond the ridge, but again, nothing. The trees swayed, and shadows stretched in impossible directions, sometimes moving contrary to the gusts, trailing behind trunks that did not bend. I blinked, shook my head, and tried to rationalize. Perhaps a small lightning strike had occurred days ago, and the forest floor had retained its scent, its heat, its decay. But even as I thought it, the air shifted. The smell sharpened, tangling with the bitter pine, carrying a hint of something older, something buried, something returned. I slowed my pace. The trail narrowed, forcing me closer to the edge of the ridge. Beneath me, the slope dropped sharply to a river gorge that roared quietly, muffled by the wind. The shadows seemed to pool at the base of the trees, shifting like oil on water, slow and deliberate. I could feel them, not consciously, but in the prickling at the back of my neck, the tension under my skin. I told myself it was exhaustion, that my mind was pulling tricks after hours of hiking alone. But even as I said it, the smell thickened, as though the wind itself were breathing smoke into my lungs. I reached a clearing where the trees thinned, revealing the skeletal remains of a long-abandoned village. Roofs had collapsed decades ago, leaving jagged frames silhouetted against the gray sky. The wind gusted stronger here, whistling through gaping windows and hollow doorways. Ash floated through the air, settling on cracked floorboards and stone chimneys. I stepped cautiously among the ruins, my boots kicking up more flakes, and I noticed scorch marks on the ground. Not recent, not blackened as if burned by a campfire, but the pale, almost white patches that seemed to appear and vanish when I turned away. My rational mind protested. It was simply the light, shadows, fatigue, but I felt it, a pull at the edge of my awareness, as if the scent itself had a shape and purpose. I found the center of the village, a square overgrown with weeds. The wind swirled violently here, pressing against my chest, tugging at my hair. The smell of burning filled every breath now, relentless, mingling with the damp decay of rotting timber. I turned slowly, scanning for any source. Nothing moved, nothing alive, but I could sense presence. It was behind me, to my left, even directly above me at times, always at the edge of sight. I wanted to shout, to call out to break the spell, but the sound caught in my throat, stifled by the wind that carried the burning smell into my lungs with unnerving insistence. I tried to track it, to follow the direction from which it seemed strongest. Step by step, I navigated the ruins, each movement accompanied by the subtle, almost imperceptible sound of dry leaves scraping against something unseen. My heart thudded, a hollow rhythm in the echoing emptiness. I knew there was nothing alive here to pursue me, and yet I felt hunted. The sense intensity grew with each cautious step, now clinging to my clothing, my hair, filling my mouth with its bitter sweetness. I felt the shadows stretch toward me, climbing the sides of walls and frames, pressing thin, black fingers along my skin without touching. The forest was no longer outside the village. It had bled in, merging with the ruined structures in some uncanny geometry, a lattice of wind and ash and absence. I stumbled over a broken beam, catching myself against the edge of a collapsed doorway. The wind shifted suddenly, almost violently, and the smell hit me full force. I gagged, inhaled sharply, and realized I had been holding my breath unconsciously. The ash swirled in intricate patterns, spiraling upward and then falling back down as if dancing to music I could not hear. And then I saw it. A faint, glowing haze hovering above the remnants of what had once been the village square, like a heat shimmer but darker, tinged with copper and iron. The smell emanated from it, concentrated, purposeful, alive. I froze. Rational thought evaporated. The haze pulsed, expanding and contracting, and in its center, faint silhouettes shimmered, shapes that weren't entirely human or entirely shadow. My mind tried to rationalize. Fumes, hallucination, exhaustion, but deep inside I knew I had disturbed something ancient, something that had lain hidden in this abandoned place, returning with wind and ash and the scent of fire that was never lit. It had followed me from the ridge, using the forest as conduit, learning the cadence of my breathing, the pattern of my steps. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my eyes on the haze, but the shadows of the ruins moved against me, converging in ways that made the space impossible to measure. The wind wrapped around me like a snake, constricting, lifting me toward the center of the square. My boots kicked up ash, scattering it through the air, but the swirl only intensified. The smell filled my mouth and nose, sweet, bitter, metallic, impossible to expel. My skin prickled as if the air itself had teeth. I stumbled, fell to my hands and knees on the cold stone. And then I understood, in a flash of terror that left my entire body rigid. The scent was not smoke. It was memory, compressed and concentrated. Each inhalation carried with it the trace of every fire ever lit in this place, every ember, every death, every ritual of binding that had taken place before the village fell to ruin. The wind carried it all forward, all at once, a history of combustion preserved in scent, and now it was mine. It had been waiting for me, and I had been walking into it, step by step, trailing curiosity and breath. I wanted to flee, to run, but my legs refused. The haze thickened, coiling around me like smoke that refused to dissipate, carrying the acrid sweetness deeper into my lungs. The shadows pressed closer, mirroring the undulating patterns of ash above. The wind whispered through the broken eaves and shattered window frames, forming words I could almost understand, fragments of a language I had never learned yet felt compelled to recognize. Something ancient, patient, and knowing had noticed me, and now it was here. I drew my final shuddering breath, and the haze inhaled with me. The wind quieted for an instant, a pregnant pause in which I felt all of time, all of fire, all of ruin, converge on the tips of my senses. Then the village was silent again, empty, still. Only the smell remained, curling in my nostrils, lingering against my skin like a second shadow. I realized with a slow, suffocating clarity that the fire was never behind me, never before me. It had been inside me all along, awakened by the wind, carried with me from the ridge, and now it would follow unceasing until the air itself became a ruin. I staggered to my feet. The trail beyond the village stretched like a ribbon of gray, the wind tugging at my jacket and whispering faintly of ash and copper. I wanted to leave, to descend toward the river and escape this invisible blaze, but I already knew. Wherever I went, the scent would follow. There would always be the taste of something burning on my tongue, the heat of a fire I could not see licking my skin, shadows stretching where they should not. And perhaps, if I paused too long, the village would rise again, or I would rise with it, a flickering ember in the smoke of a history that refused to be forgotten. The wind carried a scent of something burning, and I walked straight into it. The forest was quiet in a way that pressed against my ears, a hush that seemed to absorb the usual chatter of birds and insects. I had been hiking for hours, winding along a narrow trail through the high ridges, when I first noticed the sign. It was a simple wooden post, roughly carved letters that read, "Summit 2 miles." I paused, brushing sweat from my brow, and looked around. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and a chill had begun to settle over the trail despite the sun still clinging to the horizon. I moved forward, boots crunching over the littered leaves and brittle pine needles. A soft rustle echoed through the trees, just beyond peripheral vision, and I turned sharply, catching nothing but shifting shadows. The forest was empty, or at least it appeared so, but a sense of being watched had settled behind my eyes. Half an hour later, I passed the same sign again. At first, I thought it was a trick of memory or a doubled path, but the lettering was different. Now it read, "Almost there, don't turn back." I blinked, stepped closer, and ran my fingers over the worn wood. The texture was rough, splintered in places, metal nails rusted and cold. I could feel the sun fading through the trees, long shafts of light stabbing through the canopy. A knot of unease grew in my chest. Signs didn't change. That's not how trails worked. I forced myself to move onward. The trail narrowed, roots clawing across the path like gnarled hands, and the wind whispered through the branches, carrying the faint metallic scent of rust and wet soil. Every so often, a leaf twitched with no breeze to stir it, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. When I reached the next sign, it was wooden like the first, nailed crookedly to a bent post. Its letters had shifted again. "Wrong way. Keep going." I froze, the hairs on my arms prickling. Wrong way? I remembered turning the trail left at the fork, following the map I had carefully studied before setting out. But this sign seemed impossible. The trail beneath my feet had not shifted, yet the message contradicted memory itself. A cloud passed over the sun, throwing the forest into dim gray, and I felt the first real sting of panic. I pressed forward, rationalizing some prank by hikers, perhaps old vandalized signs. But when the next sign appeared, the words were no longer benign. "You shouldn't be here." I stopped abruptly. My breathing sounded loud in my ears, mingling with the creak of the trees. The wood was familiar, yet wrong. Grain patterns seemed to ripple under my fingers like water, letters curling subtly as if alive. I stepped back, tried to retrace my steps, but the trail behind me was unfamiliar. The ridge I thought I had passed earlier now twisted in impossible ways. The undergrowth thicker, the shadows darker. Every sign thereafter changed the moment I looked away. "Keep walking, they're watching." Then "Turn back or never leave." Then "You've already chosen." The forest seemed to pulse with intention. Shadows stretched and leaned toward me, leaves rustled when I was still, and the faint whispering of the wind took on a cadence I could almost understand, a rhythmic taunt in a language I didn't know but recognized in instinct. I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion, paranoia from isolation and fading daylight. My throat was dry, muscles tense, yet the signs kept appearing, guiding me, shaping the trail around me with every step. I noticed something else. The texture of the signs changed subtly as I passed. Some posts were rough with age, others smooth and unervingly new, as if freshly carved in the moments I looked away. The nails glimmered darkly, and in certain angles, the shadows within the letters seemed to writhe, elongate, twist into shapes that my rational mind could not hold on to. My hands shook as I touched one, feeling the grain shift beneath my fingertips like it had memory, like it remembered me and my path. The forest began to close in. Twisting roots now snagged my boots, and the canopy blocked more light, turning the trail into a tunnel of dark green and black. I tried to mark my route, scratch lines in the dirt, drop pine cones, but when I looked back, the trail behind me had no marks. It was as if I had never been there. Each sign seemed to anticipate my approach, rotating its words in a deliberate, cruel choreography. The messages became personal. "You'll never leave alive. Then we know your name," though no one had spoken. My pulse spiked. I swallowed hard, tasting copper on my tongue. My legs moved almost automatically, drawn forward by fear, curiosity, and some deeper compulsion I couldn't name. The wind itself seemed to push me along, scattering dry leaves that danced like flames across the path. The forest was alive, breathing, and it had taken an interest in me. I came to a final clearing as the last light of day sank behind the mountains. There, a lone sign stood, massive and freshly hewn, the wood darker than any other I had passed. I approached cautiously, every step echoing in the quiet that had swallowed the trail. My boots scuffed dry earth. My hands trembled. The letters were precise, deliberate. "Turn around and live, or keep walking and become the sign." The words burned themselves into my mind. I felt the forest shift around me, trees bending slightly toward the sign as if leaning to watch. A gust of wind caught my hair and clothes, carrying the rustle of leaves, the whisper of unseen creatures, and the metallic scent of fear. My eyes darted around the clearing. There was no one, no movement, but the trail itself seemed to pulse with expectation. And then I understood. The signs were never just warnings. They were invitations, judgments, decisions written in wood. Those who ignored them vanished, leaving only the memory of their path, recorded in the trail, in the shifting letters, in the forest that remembered everything. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I took a hesitant step backward, but my foot caught a root. I stumbled, caught myself, and glanced once more at the sign. The letters were changing before my eyes. "Step forward, and you will join us." I froze, the dusk pressing down, shadows pooling in impossible ways around the edges of the clearing. The wind whistled through the branches, carrying the faint, unmistakable sound of my own footsteps echoed back to me. Slower, heavier, deliberate. The forest had a voice now, and it was mine. The path stretched behind me, familiar yet foreign, twisting in impossible geometries I could not trust. I realized then, with a chill that burned through my chest, that the trail had never been neutral. It had been waiting, shaping, deciding. Every sign, every rustle, every shift in shadow and route had been preparing me for a choice I could not escape. There was no map, no rational exit, only the forest, its living signs, and the inexorable pull forward. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening. The wind whispered again, faintly, almost tenderly, yet threaded with menace. The sign before me pulsed in the dim light, letters curling and twisting like smoke. "Welcome home." When I opened my eyes, the trail behind me was gone. Only the signs remained, scattered through the undergrowth, their words shifting and settling into new messages, waiting for the next traveler, the next mistake. And I understood with absolute certainty. Some paths do not merely lead forward. Some paths lead into the forest itself, and into the signs that watch, remember, and wait. I stepped forward, boots crunching against pine needles, leaves rustling in reply, the forest alive and patient, guiding me into the unknown.